From the air, the finely branched channels of a salt marsh suggests a living organism, spreading from the ocean to the farthest reaches of the estuary. Once within the marsh, it becomes obvious that a salt marsh is actually made up of thousands of plants and animals, nature's finely tuned ecosystem, boasting a rare diversity of life. In this video, you'll learn about this invaluable ecosystem and the important role it plays in scientific research. This is the Carpinteria salt marsh. It's part of an estuary that receives fresh water from one direction and salt water from another direction. The fresh water drains from the nearby hills and mountains of the adjacent watershed, and the salt water enters through the estuary mouth with the incoming tides. Every marsh is different because of a number of factors. For example, the amount of fresh water versus salt water, the amount of deep water habitat versus intertidal wetlands, the geographic location, the climate, and the geology. These unique conditions create uncommon habitats that can be home to rare and endangered species.
In general, Carpinteria salt marsh receives only periodic fresh water from rainfall, whereas the mouth remains open permanently, allowing for inundation by tides. The geological setting is unique because the marsh is cradled in a structural basin between the upfaulted mountains to the north and the upfaulted Carpinteria reef bordering the marsh on the south side.
Other elements that characterize the Carpinteria salt marsh are a Mediterranean climate and a geographic location between northern and southern California, resulting in a number of plants and animals reaching their northern limits in the vicinity of the marsh. The Carpinteria marsh, like all wetlands, serves a variety of beneficial purposes to both people and wildlife. When toxic substances wash downhill from the watershed, plants and soil organisms act as a biofilter to remove toxins before they reach our beaches and oceans. The marsh helps prevent flooding to surrounding neighborhoods by absorbing rain overflow, and the marsh is a vital home to fish.
Halibut and several other fish actually use the marsh as a nursery ground. In fact, 75% of all fish that are caught commercially use wetlands at some point during their life.
In addition to its other benefits, the Carpinteria marsh functions as a research laboratory for scientists at the University of California and other institutions. The university is actually just one of 17 owners of the marsh. Other owners range from the City of Carpinteria and the Land Trust for Santa Barbara County, to homeowner associations, to the Union Pacific Railroad, whose tracks border the marsh.
The advantage of multiple property owners is they can accomplish larger goals as a community effort with greater resources and more influence.
Carpinteria Salt Marsh is part of the University of California Natural Reserve System. The mission is to contribute to understanding and wise management of the earth and its natural systems by promoting research, teaching, and public service at protected natural areas throughout the state of California.
Our purpose is to try and set aside pockets of open space throughout the county that will, in fact, provide permanent protection for habitat and for the views that we really treasure in this community.
In the marsh, as in any community, all things are connected in one way or another. While the birds flying overhead seem pretty far removed from tiny organisms in the mud, they are intimately affected through the food chain. At the bottom of the food chain are microscopic algae resting on the mud underwater. They are eaten by small invertebrate animals like crabs, snails, worms, and clams. These invertebrates are eaten in turn by fish like halibut, mudsuckers, and sculpin. And then along come the birds, who feed on the fish. If something happens to the small algae organisms, it eventually has an effect on the birds. There are 3 types of fish species found in the marsh. The first type are fish that live their entire life in the marsh. An example are long-jawed mudsuckers. The second type are fish that come into the marsh on the incoming tide to eat and then return to the ocean. Leopard sharks are an example. The third type use the marsh as a nursery. They live their first year of life in the marsh and then return to the ocean. Halibut fall into this category. Most people don't realize that the marsh is a thriving nursery for halibut. Andy Brooks is a University of California scientist who studies the marsh fish.
Some of the things that I study are the different conditions that are found throughout the marsh that determine which species are found where. For instance, we've discovered that the size and the shapes of the channels have a big effect. We've also found that the types of food, the small shrimp and smaller fish and worms that many of the fish that live in the marsh eat, has an important effect. And finally, the effects of the sediment that wash down from the hills into the marsh determine a lot of the different types of food that are found here, and so they're also very important.
Gathering information and conducting experiments allows scientists to apply this information to other marshes throughout the world and can make the difference between the success of a species or its failure. The scientific plant work done in the marsh is also invaluable to wetland scientists worldwide. Plants are essential to provide a habitat for animals as well as being part of the food chain. The scientists refer to different zones of vegetation in the marsh. The differences have to do with flooding patterns, amounts of salt, and the elevations. In each zone, the plants have adapted in different ways. For example, near the upper edges of the marsh, the plants have adapted to the conditions of less flooding but greater salinity. And there are unique plants that reside above the influence of the tides, which further enhance the biological richness of the estuarine environment. The most common marsh plant is pickle weed. It thrives in environments that are flooded with salt water every couple of days. There are some plants and animals that are not native to the marsh and are only here because of past interference from humans. Early explorers to the area in the 1700s and 1800s brought seeds of non-native plants that have caused problems for the natives. And more recently, people have imported plants from all over the world, and seeds from these exotic plants wash downhill to the marsh or come in by the tons.
These are plants that originated in other countries and that have been introduced here. And there are a lot of plants that have come here, of course, but some of these have a very aggressive tendency to take over large amounts of area, such as this patch of ice plant here, where there are virtually no native plants left in the whole patch. The ice plant has completely taken over. So it's these invasive exotic plants that are a big concern for managers of natural areas.
One of the truly devastating results of human actions and pressure from non-natives is the threatening extinction of endangered species.
Nature is beautiful in part because of its wonderful natural diversity. As species become extinct, that is, die out, we are fast on our way to becoming a one-dimensional world. The edge and adjacent upland area of the marsh is very important because there is a great diversity of plants and animals. Unfortunately, this is the area that is often filled to become housing, airports, and parking lots.
In fact, about 80% of historic marshes have been destroyed to make room for urban sprawl. In Carpinteria, the high marsh is rare, and it reflects a Mediterranean climate. It has low salt in the winter because of rainfall and the freshwater flooding from creeks, but high salt content in the summer due to the characteristic summer drought. Endangered plants like the salt marsh daisy depend upon this fluctuation in environmental conditions to germinate in the winter when the salinity is low, and then produce flowers, seed, and die as the salinity gets high. The salt marsh bird's beak is another endangered species in the Carpinteria salt marsh. As with other unusual plants and animals, it can only live in specific conditions and currently grows in a few places in the world. Bird's beak lives in the part of the marsh that is only occasionally inundated by tides. Many plants have mechanisms that will excrete excess salt like the bird's beak. As another adaptation to the stressful environment, the bird's beak lives as a parasite that taps into the root system of adjacent plants for its water and nutrients.
Salt marsh bird's beak is a very good example of how special, how highly refined the adaptations of salt marsh organisms are to these local conditions. And with these narrow endemics, these species that live in a very narrow geographic range, I think they serve to highlight the special nature of the place. It gives me a special sense of place to know that this plant only grows in this area. The more we learn about the salt marsh, the more special things there are here. So perhaps its greatest value is just indicating how unique this sort of habitat is.
The bird's beak uses the salt from the sea and excretes it on the plant surface, which discourages chewing insects.
This is another parasitic plant that occurs in the salt marsh. This bright orange thready thing is called salt marsh dodder Unlike salt marsh birdsbeak, this plant does not photosynthesize. It takes food from the host, and ultimately it will kill this little patch of pickle weed here.
The plant's thin tendrils tightly wrap around the host plant and suffocate it to death. In contrast to birdsbeak, salt marsh dodder gets all its food from its host plant.
It opens space in the marsh that other species can come into, so it may help with the diversity of plants in the marsh for these patches of pickleweed to periodically be killed off. It's sort of like a little forest fire, allowing other species to move in.
Another important function of the marsh plants is that they act as a biofilter to help clean the water before it gets to our beaches and oceans. Whenever beaches in the area are checked for water quality, the area next to the marsh always rates the cleanest because of the biofiltering capabilities of the marsh plants. The marsh is an important stop for migrating birds. Some birds come from as far away as Alaska, stop here, and then continue on their way to South America. Others live here year-round. There are small shore birds like willets and godwits, and there are larger birds like egrets and the great blue herons. Endangered species like the Belding savanna sparrows and the light-footed clapperwells also make the marsh their home. Bob Hansen has been studying Carpinteria marsh birds for the last 10 years.
One of the threats of the clapper rail and Belding savanna sparrow breeding is, of course, a loss of habitat. We have here now a very rare habitat that encourages them and supports them. But there are also predators, and predators include the native coyote, the native raccoon and skunk, and also the non-native house cats that are running wild in the salt marsh and are difficult to eradicate.
A little bit here.
In the same way that different animals are connected to each other through the food chain, different neighborhoods in the Carpinteria Valley can affect change because the watershed washes materials downhill into the marsh. Mark Page studies some of these connections.
In the hills north of the marsh is occupied by agriculture, and these agricultural activities use fertilizers that contain nitrogen. The nitrogen can wash into the marsh after rainfall events and during normal irrigation operations, and these inputs of nitrogen could influence the growth of green macroalgae. Excessive growths of macroalgae could have an adverse effect on marsh fauna, smothering animals that live in the mud, affecting bird feeding behavior, and then after it dies and decomposes, deplete oxygen. Low levels of oxygen could negatively affect the fish and invertebrates too.
There are many influences at work in the marsh. In addition to biological factors, there are government regulations, property owners, and university scientists, many of them with competing interests. Trying to preserve the marsh environment while balancing all these factors led to the formation of a marsh management plan funded in part by the State Coastal Conservancy. And like the cutting-edge scientific work being done at the marsh, the management plan is setting new standards in environmental management.
This is a challenging experiment to take an ecologically fragile area that is owned by 17 different property owners and place it into a cooperative management scheme that is protective of the resources and balances everyone's interests.
Just some of the competing interests that are part of the management plan include the 17 property owners, flood control, the national marine fisheries, and mosquito abatement. To minimize conflict, the mission and policies of these diverse organizations are all incorporated into the marsh management plan. This provides a coordinated effort to solve management challenges. With over 45 organizations having a stake in the marsh, it requires a strong plan for them to work together to fulfill the University of California's mission for research, education, and public service. Of the many management programs contained in the plan, the Marsh Restoration and Management Program is of particular interest to local Carpinterians. This is because a weedy field at the eastern end of the Salt Marsh Reserve is being restored and converted into a new marsh park, open to the public. Scientists are applying the research gained in the Marsh Reserve to help nature create a marsh park out of an abandoned field. Just as the marsh's biological system is a complicated set of relationships, so is the marsh management plan. But without it, the future of the marsh would be at risk. And so, as the great blue heron scans the horizon, The halibut feeds in the shallow channels, and the pickle weed soaks up salt out of the ocean water. Life goes on in this finely tuned ecosystem, the Carpinteria Salt Marsh.